Our Story, God's Story, Week 19, Esther. After Persia defeated the Babylonian Empire, some Jews began returning to Jerusalem. Others still lived in exile. This is the story of Esther, and it takes place around 460 BC. This happened in the days of King Xerxes, who reigned over 127 provinces stretching from India to Ethiopia. Xerxes needed a new queen, and he decreed that beautiful young women from around the kingdom should be brought to the palace and presented to him. Now there was a certain Jew named Mordecai. His family had been exiled from Jerusalem along with many others. This man had a beautiful cousin called Esther. When her parents had died, Mordecai adopted her and raised her as his own daughter. Esther, along with many other young women, were brought to the king's harem at the fortress of Susa. Esther had not told anyone of her nationality, for Mordecai had told her not to do so. When Esther was taken to King Xerxes, the king loved her more than the other young women. He declared her queen. Mordecai became a palace official, but Esther continued to keep her family background a secret. Haman, a descendant of the Amalekites, who were ancient enemies of the Jews, was second in command in the kingdom. Haman hated Mordecai and decided to kill not just Mordecai, but all the Jews in the kingdom. Haman rolled the dice, called Pur, and chose the 13th day of the month of Adar for his genocide. Using this influence and telling lies about Jews, Haman convinced King Xerxes to go along with his plan. Mordecai sent a message to his niece, Queen Esther, asking her to help. She replied, "The whole world knows that anyone who appears before the king without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his gold scepter. And the king has not called for me to come to him in more than a month." Mordecai sent his reply to Esther, "If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who can say but that you have been elevated to the palace for just such a time as this?" Esther replied to Mordecai, "Gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I am willing to die." Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court of the palace. When King Xerxes saw Queen Esther standing there, he welcomed her, holding out his gold scepter to her. Then he asked her, "What do you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it's half of this kingdom." And Esther replied, "If it please your majesty, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for the king." Xerxes and Haman enjoyed their dinner with Esther, and she asked them back the next night. Haman felt honored to be invited by the queen, and his pride grew. In the meantime, he continued his plot. He had a massive scaffold built onto which to execute Mordecai. At Queen Esther's second dinner, King Xerxes asked her what she really wanted. And so Queen Esther replied, "If your majesty is pleased with me, my petition is that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us." "Who would do such a thing?" King Xerxes demanded. "Who would dare touch you?" Esther replied, "This wicked Haman is our enemy." Haman grew pale with fright before the king and the queen. King Xerxes was enraged with Haman's deceit and ordered him killed on the same scaffold Haman had built to kill Mordecai. Mordecai became the second in command of the kingdom. the Jewish people were saved, and they celebrated the day of Adar 13th each year as Purim, remembering how the providence of God, the wisdom of Mordecai, and the courage of Esther had saved them. To this day, Purim is celebrated early in March.
Good morning. Today is February 27th. My name is Jamie Okusko. I'm filling in for Pastor Mary Beth. A few weeks ago, I asked my students to write a cautionary tale using the 5 assigned vocabulary words. Much to my surprise, any of them didn't know what a cautionary tale was. And reflecting on the lesson, I began to wonder how many of us do know a cautionary tale, or more importantly, know how to heed the warning when we see one. The book of Esther is a cautionary tale. It has all the makings of a Hollywood blockbuster, has an evil villain driven by hate and vengeance, a nail-biting plot, and the most unlikely of heroes, a girl. Not just any girl, a Jewish woman, a beautiful Jewish woman who, by keeping her nationality a secret, has risen to the place of queen. In a predictable plot move, Mordecai has learned of Haman's plot to destroy the Jews. Mordecai goes to Esther for help. He tells Esther, if you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance will surely come to the Jews, but you and your family will certainly die. Being the ever-selfless hero that she is, Esther replies, I will go to the king. If I must die, I'm willing to die. While many of us might have attended such a movie, we probably would have known the outcome before we got there. The biblical blockbuster has 2 cautionary tales to tell us. The first is this: vengeance and hatred. As believers and followers of Jesus Christ, we know that vengeance and hatred don't care a thing. In fact, it's the quickest way to destroy a person's soul. But the book of Esther has been around since 460 BC. You would think we have learned to heed that cautionary tale, but indeed we have not. Throughout our cultural history, we have one example after another of people being filled with vengeance and hatred to the point where they are destroying things. Genocides have been committed by leaders filled with hatred and a thirst for vengeance. And while we may think that we are above this in our day and age, great social injustices have been committed by the vengeance and hate of one political entity over another. Great leaders of human social advancement have been sacrificed on the altar of hatred and vengeance for the sole purpose of keeping one group of people superior to another. This is deeply saddening because as followers of Christ, we know that any movement that calls for a hateful and vengeful rhetoric, for us to categorize a group of people and deem them as inferior or beneath another, that's something we simply cannot support. Much like the cautionary tale of vengeance, we also have tales of unlikely heroes throughout history. People who stepped forward to fight those injustices, like Martin Luther King, for example. When he was told by political leaders to wait, his reply was, for years now, I've heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with a piercing familiarity. That wait almost always means never. We must come to see that justice too long delayed is justice denied. And speaking of the power, Mahatma Gandhi once said, power is of 2 kinds. One is obtained by the fear of punishment, the other by acts of love. Power obtained by acts of love is 1,000 times more enduring and effective than that obtained by fear of punishment. When asked to stand and move for a white man, Rosa Parks stayed seated because she didn't feel very good about being asked to give up her seat. She said she had the right to stay right where she was. She knew she would be arrested, but she wanted that particular bus driver to know and to see that they were being treated unfairly as individuals and as people. How many of us have found ourselves in a position to be unlikely heroes and we might just not have recognized it? How many of us have the opportunity to stand up and do what is right, to speak for those who can't speak for themselves? John Wesley, our great Methodist leader, he was such a man. In 1736-37, John Wesley confronted the abolition of slavery. He once visited the British colony of Georgia, where he saw firsthand how slaves were treated. It prompted him to write a pamphlet titled Thoughts on Slavery. He went on to publish it and generated much dislike amongst the plantation owners. Slave trade was very lucrative at that time. That didn't stop John Wesley, though. He went on to give sermon after sermon, some in Bristol, which was the foremost slave trading post at that time. There were even protests at his sermons. Even though Wesley fought the injustices of slavery 1,850 years ago, we still see that injustice raging today. When delivering his verdict in the trial of the 3 white men who were convicted of murdering black jogger Ahmaud Arbery, Judge Walmsley said this: "At a minimum, Ahmaud Arbery's death should prompt us to consider expanding our definition of what a neighbor may and may not be and how we treat them." Judge Walmsley said, "I argue that maybe a neighbor is more than someone who just owns property around our house. We as Christians know that everyone is our neighbor." Allow me to just share with you just one last example. It was retold by Philip J. Schwartz. It's a story set in June of 1866, and the South has surrendered to the North, and the battles have stopped on the battlefield. But the skirmishes of a divided nation continue to rage on the color lines of white and black America. It is Communion Sunday at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Richmond, Virginia. When the minister is ready to administer the Holy Communion, one of the first to rise and walk to the altar to accept communion was a very tall, well-dressed Negro man, a very black man. He walked with an air of military authority, and to great surprise to the congregation and all who were present, the effect that it had was startling. And for several moments, no one stood or moved. They all retained their seats in solemn silence. Deeply chagrined by the attempt of federal troops to humiliate and embarrass them at such a holy communion service. Dr. Mingrove, the minister, looked embarrassed. Just then, a man seated towards the front immediately rose and in his usual dignified and self-possessed manner walked up the middle aisle of the church to the rail, reverently knelt down to partake in communion, not far from where the black man was kneeled. The lofty conception of duty by the white-haired old gentleman under such provoking and irritating circumstances had a majestical effect amongst the communicants, who then followed his lead and rose and went forward to accept communion. That tall man, that white-haired gentleman who walked up and humbly knelt to take communion next to the black man, that was Robert E. Lee. At the end of this month, the month devoted to bringing awareness to the Black history and the plight of our Black brothers and sisters, our Black neighbors, may we continue to be the Christian voice that fights for justice. Like Esther and John Wesley, may we continue to be the individuals who stand up and do what's right, simply because it is the right thing to do. Amen.